Today's webinar is entitled Navigate and Fund Your IP Strategy During the COVID-19 Uncertainty and Beyond. Hopefully that doesn't come as a surprise and you're all in the right place. Today's webinar is being presented by Vicki Strachan, who is a chartered UK and European patent attorney at Mathys Squire, and Ross Robertson, who is an international tax partner at BDO. So hopefully that's all you need to carry on to get going. So without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Vicki and Ross.
Hello everyone, I'm Vicki Strachan and I've been a qualified UK and European patent attorney for over 20 years. I'm going to start with a couple of objectives. So one of the objectives will be to understand what an IP audit is and does and why it is important to update it regularly. Identify what unregistered IP rights are, where they may arise, and key considerations in managing them. Having a patent landscaping and how it can help you understand your commercial landscape and drive innovation within your business. Understand the territorial nature of registered IP rights and the importance of not overlooking global competition as we all come out of lockdown. Learn how to effectively manage an IP portfolio whilst also managing cash flow constraints. I don't think we'll actually get too far into that, but some of the considerations will be there. Understand the tax reliefs relating to the investment in and exploitation of IP, and consider the potential future impact of the current COVID-19 crisis. So as I said, my name is Vicki Strachan, and I've been qualified UK and European for over 20 years. I've worked with loads of different types of clients, from startup to multinational, and with a few other IP firms. But I'm now head of the Oxford office for Mathys Squire. And at the Oxford office, we've been working hard during lockdown to help businesses, and that's primarily who either have pivoted their business model so that they can continue to trade whilst the lockdown restrictions are in place, or they've been innovating during enforced downtime so that they can hit the ground running with new or improved products or services when the lockdown restrictions are sufficiently eased. Aside from the welfare of our loved ones during this time, many of our priorities have lain in managing the financial health of our businesses and protecting our teams so that when lockdown's lifted, we're in the best possible position to drive our businesses forward. And many of us have been given, to some extent at least, the gift of time, in the sense that the daily commute is no longer necessary and we can't get out and about as freely as we would like, and certainly as we did before. And there are businesses that have used this time to steer their way around the economic challenges using innovation in the form of new and improved products or services, or rebranding even,
has joined the meeting.
So they can position themselves front and center, ready for the global upturn. But whether you're just trying to weather the storm or actively innovating your business out of danger, it will, in any case, be imperative to ensure that your market position is secure. And now is a really good time to take stock and consider what will set your business above your competitors when the commercial arena starts to return to some form of normality, whatever that will look like. And intellectual property can be critical here because it protects the key elements of your business from copying by a competitor. So taking the time to perform an IP audit to map out what's already protected, what may need to be protected, and almost most importantly, a strategy for securing that protection which fits with your financial circumstances, can be a hugely valuable process. You may be, if you're already involved in intellectual property, you may be concerned with incurring and escalating IP costs without really knowing whether or not these costs are related to elements that are essential to the success of the business. And you may even want to have a look at what your main competitors have been up to, who they are, and what their main areas of research and development have been in recent years, so that you can determine where you sit within your own commercial landscape and what areas might be worth branching into. It's quite weird making this presentation to what is essentially an empty room, and I'd quite like to get a feel for my audience and what might be most important to you. I'd therefore be grateful if you'd complete poll number 1 for me. So we'd like to know if you're a business that's been able to continue more or less as usual during lockdown, a business that's had to pivot your offering in order to continue trading, a business that's not been able to trade at all during lockdown and have not used the downtime to improve your existing offering or create new products or services, or none of the above. Okay. And okay, that's interesting. So over half have been able to continue more or less as usual, and nearly a quarter have pivoted their offering so that they can continue to trade. It's actually really positive, and a little more positive than I was expecting. So there are a fair few of you here that have pivoted your business to continue trading during lockdown. I have no way of knowing what that pivoting looks like, but in general, IP and its importance to protecting your hard work often gets forgotten, especially at times like this when there's an awful lot of other stuff that needs to be considered and done. Sometimes people don't realize that they have or should have intellectual property that can protect their revenue stream by, stopping competitors from being able to piggyback off their innovative and creative hard work. And these are the very things that are likely to attract customers to your business rather than your competitors, i.e. your USP, if you like. This will be especially important as lockdown eases and everyone, including overseas businesses, emerge from the bubble we've all inhabited for however many months it's been. So I wanted to start just by quickly summarizing what IP is. And the World Intellectual Property Office, or WIPO as it's affectionately known, defines intellectual property as creations of the mind, inventions, literary or artistic works, and symbols, names, and images used in commerce. But it really is a lot more than that. It should at least include designs as well, and some intangible things like know-how, commercial and trade secrets, and confidential information, which are not strictly intellectual property, but act in much the same way and can be equally powerful if they're properly safeguarded and enforced. So some intellectual property rights are registered. I seem to be missing a slide. I apologize. Some intellectual property rights are registered. So patents can be obtained for inventions, trademarks can be registered for things like names, logos, and strap lines, and aesthetically novel designs can be registered. But there are many unregistered IP rights that come into force automatically. There's no registration required, and examples of that would be copyright, which would include software, unregistered design rights, semiconductor topography rights, which is just the way an integrated circuit is laid out, know-how, and trade secrets. What I often tell clients is that, wherever there is innovation or innovative input anywhere in a business, there is likely to be intellectual property. Now, some elements of the business are peripheral and may not necessarily be particularly important to your business goals or your revenue stream. Others will be crucial in the sense that if a competitor copies or recreates that element of the business, it could reduce your market share by stealing customers that would otherwise have come to you, or have some other detrimental effect on the business. So when we think about optimizing our IP rights and making them work for you to benefit and safeguard your business, the real power lies in knowing that they exist, who owns them, what they could do, what they could or do protect, and whether or not what they protect is important to your commercial revenue stream. And this is where an IP audit comes in. Let's go to the poll. Perhaps we could completely complete poll 2 for me. So it's simply, have you or your business ever performed an IP audit? Yes, no, and don't know. Just closing the poll now. Okay, so about 30% of you have been involved in some way in an IP audit before. Little more no, and the rest didn't know. An IP audit is defined as a systematic review of a company's IP assets and related risks and opportunities. So it is a little more than just knowing what IP rights you have. A thorough IP audit involves not only a review of all the company's IP assets, registered and unregistered, but also the company's IP-related agreements, policies, procedures, and even competitors' IP, which I'll come on to briefly later. Of course, at a time like this, many companies haven't got the time or money for all of that. I know that many of you are focused on other things, but it is important to think about safeguarding your revenue stream, not just during lockdown, but afterwards when the whole world has started trading again. And at the very least, it might be worth thinking about having a mini IP audit performed to identify all of your IP assets, both registered and unregistered, match them to the elements of the business that they protect. And that way we can see any gaps. Any gaps can be readily identified, and then prioritize any actions that could or should be taken to optimize your IP strategy according to how crucial they are to safeguarding your revenue stream or securing funding for your business. And actually at the Oxford office, to help local businesses during the COVID-19 crisis, we've been offering a free consultation and mini IP audit, which results in a short report with recommendations in order of priority to the business, so that it's almost a kind of checklist, really should do, could do, and it would be nice if we ever get to that. And of course, the commercial arena is changing rapidly, and it's important to review and update your IP portfolio and strategy regularly to ensure that it remains properly aligned to your business goals. Because, you know, during lockdown, plenty of businesses have pivoted the way they do business. Others have changed completely. And it's important when, you know, as changes occur, that the IP audit is updated so that it can be matched again to exactly what you're doing at the time. This is to ensure that your largest revenue streams are the most tightly protected. And it is the associated IP in those areas of the business that can enhance their value, so that it doesn't, to the extent that it doesn't just stop competitors from copying you and taking some of the market share, but it can also act as surety and security for investment and borrowing to help fund the growth of your business, but only if you know that the IP exists. So the questions to ask yourself are, does your IP adequately protect your current commercial activity? And will your IP portfolio and strategy be aligned with your commercial goals after lockdown and as the whole world starts to trade again? And so that's our first top tip, top IP tip, which is to perform an IP audit and update it regularly. So I wanted to take a moment to re-emphasize the potential importance of your unregistered IP rights. I have already touched on this, but they can be so easily forgotten, and yet they can be the most powerful IP right within a business, provided its IP strategy includes policies for safeguarding them and using them to their full advantage. Just as some examples, the alleged copyright in the Happy Birthday song netted its owners about $2 million a year in royalties. Now, while this was disputed a few years back because the tune wasn't actually new and didn't belong to them, the principle remains the same. Copyright exists automatically when an original literary, artistic, or musical work is created and can be used to generate revenue from third parties that want to use that work in any way for commercial purposes. But its value and power can only be maximised if the IP strategy includes the right policies and procedures for safeguarding and enforcing that type of IP right. Another example is the KFC and Coca-Cola recipes, which are possibly the most famous, maybe even the most valuable trade secrets in modern history. And you only have to consider the revenue that these companies have generated on the back of those secret recipes, but only because their IP strategy includes strict policies and procedures for maintaining their secrecy. So for some businesses then, the unregistered IP rights like copyright, trade secrets and know-how may provide more powerful protection for their innovation than registered rights. These types of rights come into being automatically, but in order to be effective, you first need to identify them and then ensure that your IP strategy includes policies for safeguarding them and using them to their full advantage. So our top tip number 2 is don't forget about your unregistered IP rights. So there are many reasons why you might want to make sure that you have a clear picture of the commercial landscape in which you're operating. The first is to identify and monitor your main competitors and their commercial activity, but also to identify technical areas where R&D activity is very congested, maybe because this would indicate market trends, or it may guide you away from R&D in that particular area because so many others are already working in that space. But then on the flip side of that, it may also enable you to identify so-called white space in your commercial or technical field that may provide an opportunity for your own R&D efforts. So I've got, oh yes, poll number 3. If you could complete poll number 3 for me, please. Has your business ever performed a patent landscaping exercise? I would have said this one would be quite quick, with just yes, no, and don't know answers. Should we close the poll? Okay, so 21% have said yes to that. So patent landscaping and analysis, it can be a very powerful way of generating an overview of the commercial arena in which you're operating. And it can be important to include this in your IP strategy. So it's a service offered by companies like ours, and it's quite a specialist field, but the way that the results are presented gives a very intuitive idea of your commercial arena based on patent activity in various small technical bits of a larger technical field. So, and it can be quite important to help you to understand where your business sits within a globally competing market and provide key insights into potential technical areas of growth and innovation for your own business as we come out of lockdown and start to get back to whatever normal will look like. So tip number 3 is understand and exploit your commercial landscape. And sub-tip number 4 is don't overlook your global competitors. It is becoming increasingly important to safeguard your overseas markets against your global competitors, especially whilst our manufacturing base is still largely overseas, and especially considering that some countries may be released from the current lockdown restrictions before the UK. There are lots of different ways to put overseas IP protection in place, and this would ensure that your innovation is properly protected when the world is released from lockdown. And managing your IP budget, I know that this will be close to some people's hearts, and if you already have registered IP, you may be quite concerned about rising or escalating costs, perhaps without knowing exactly what you're paying for. You may have had to trim down your IP budget in the light of the COVID-19 crisis. But the key to a successful IP strategy is to ensure that you are only paying for what you need to protect your market share, and also to manage cash flow by staggering and even delaying actions wherever possible. there are a number of ways in which actions can be staggered, but I can see I'm kind of running out of time. So I'll just say that by prioritising key rights and using grace periods and extensions of time strategically, costs can be staggered and cash flow can be managed without undermining your potential head start as we emerge from this period of uncertainty. So our tip number 5 is be smart about your IP budget. But of course, there are other ways of making sure that you have the funds to support your business, including your IP strategy. And I'm going to hand you over to Ross Robertson of BDO now so that he can tell you more. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about some of the tax perspectives related to intangible assets. You'll see that there's quite a lot of crossover, actually, with a lot of what Vicki's spoken about on the legal side. And we would typically work together very closely with IP lawyers when we're helping businesses to define their strategy, because their IP strategy, because one can't be looked at without the other. So where I wanted to start was just to give a sense of some of the overarching themes in the world of international taxation today. And the reason for that is because the intangible asset strategy that you develop needs to account for the broader trends that are happening within the international tax environment in order for you to ensure that your strategy will be effective in achieving what you're trying to achieve. So the first theme is a real focus on substance. So we've got tax rules that very closely now link tax outcomes to where your business substance is. It is not possible to disassociate ownership of your IP from the people that are developing, enhancing, maintaining, protecting, and exploiting your IP, and expect that the tax result will simply follow the legal ownership of the IP. The tax result will follow where the people are. Another growing theme, which I also expect to accelerate as a function of the current pandemic, and we'll come on to talk about this in a bit more detail, is this concept of taxation without physical presence. So territories are increasingly looking to impose new ways of taxing businesses that reside outside their borders, but where that business is selling to customers or businesses within the territory's borders. And that's something, as I said, that I think is going to increase, given that one of the effects of the current pandemic is that, relatively speaking, digital businesses are doing better than bricks and mortar businesses. So I'll come back to that, as I said, later. Another theme is generally there is a huge drive towards increased transparency, be it through financial statements reporting or in terms of what the public demand and the media satisfies them with in terms of reporting on the tax affairs of businesses, but also increasingly new regulations being brought in that require disclosure of increasing amounts of information about a group to relevant tax authorities and potentially into a public domain. So two examples of this are the DAC 6, the EU directive, which requires disclosure of certain cross-border arrangements to tax authorities within the EU, with that information then shared amongst all relevant EU authorities. That is legislation that can catch entirely commercial transactions that don't even contemplate tax. So it's worth being aware of that. And country-by-country reporting rules would be another example of tax authorities getting increasing access to the information of how groups structure themselves at global scale. And there's talk of both the thresholds for country-by-country reporting coming down, as well as those filings potentially going public. So all of that means that you need to ensure that in an entirely transparent environment, you have an intangible asset strategy that aligns your tax outcomes with where your business drives value, and also accounts for the changing environment in terms of the increasing taxation on digital products and services, and reflects the potential commercial impact of that in terms of price points, etc. But the focus really for today is on the intangible asset strategy itself. So moving on to talk about that, why is now the right time? And I think it really comes down to we've got a critical point of overlap between legal tax and commercial considerations. So we're seeing intense disruption across a number of sectors. As Vicky's spoken about, getting a handle of your IP and protecting your IP can be business critical. But also from a tax perspective, as businesses invest more in intangible assets, which is the commercial driver at the bottom, we're seeing tax authorities react in turn to provide more focus from a tax perspective on the taxation of those intangible assets, both in terms of setting their tax policy, but also where we see controversy arising in an audit scenario. Now, just briefly, building an intangible asset strategy looks like. It starts with the IP audit that Vicki was talking about before. So really you need to understand what assets you've got comprehensively across the business, both the legally registered and the unregistered assets. Without that, you can't really build an effective intangible asset strategy from a tax perspective. But once you've got that, you can start to assess your value chain. So how do those assets contribute value to your business, and where are the people that are driving the delivery of that value? You then need to put that into the context of not only what you're doing today, but what you're going to do in the future. It can very quickly become cost prohibitive to move intangible assets across international borders. If it is nascent in one jurisdiction, then becomes successful, it can be very difficult for you to then uproot it without a prohibitive tax cost. So you need to understand where your business is likely to go and shape your strategy with that in mind, building in flexibility and optionality where you can. Once you've got that sense, you can then start looking at what are the options for funding your development. This is around grant funding, this is around R&D reliefs, and around things like the Future Fund, which we've seen introduced in the current crisis for external sources of growth capital as well. And what are the incentives that could be applied when you seek to commercialize your IP? And is there a way to manage your operational model around the requirements of those funding and incentives regimes? And then thinking about the transition impact, to the extent that you're moving from one state today to another state tomorrow, that can have significant tax consequences where intangible assets are concerned. So making sure that you identify those transition impacts. And then you end up in a constant cycle with most businesses continually seeking to further develop, which leads them back to the start of what new assets have you got, how are they driving value, how does that fit into your business plans, what's the funding and incentive overlay to that, and how do you get the asset to where you need it to be. So really the focus of today is going to be around a bit around the funding landscape in the UK, with a focus on just a brief high-level overview of the grants funding programs in the UK, the R&D relief that we've got available in the UK, and then on the commercialization side, also an overview of patent box, and really trying to put those into the context of how you make the most of them and why they're particularly relevant for many businesses in the context of the current pandemic. So first of all, just talking about the funding landscape overall, the way I broadly look at it is that grants are often there to get you through to development of a viable product or proposition. They will not wholly fund. You will need to find sources of funding from other places, be it debt or equity coming in as well. You've then got the R&D tax relief, which kicks in after you've spent the money and helps you get some of that money back so that you can reinvest in further development of the asset. And then really the commercialization piece comes in at the end of providing relief where you've developed an asset within the borders of the UK. So there's a lot of different cogs to that. I guess just a couple of observations. We don't have time to go into the detail of that entirely. But in terms of the grants, there's really two broad types of grants. So you've got innovation grants, which are really focused on sort of proof of concept or pilot demonstration. Typically, you'll see them accompanied with a newly granted patent or a recently filed application, and there's often a strong element of university or commercial organization collaboration and partnership in relation to those. Then you've got growth and capital grants, which are really around helping to fund capital expenditure on new sites, relocations, expansion, refurbishment, equipment purchase, and they often come with requirements around the increase of staff headcount over a period of time. But looking at it at a high level, what both of those types of grants are seeking to do is they're seeking to support businesses which are undertaking projects which have economic, social, or environmental impact potential, where there's a demonstrable market demand with a project-specific business plan accompanying it, and where the business can demonstrate a need for funding and cash flow for match funding in order to make that a reality. Just to go into a little bit more detail on the different types of grants. So the capital and growth grants, as I said, typically would subsidize a company's investment, which is often capital expenditure, with a particular focus on businesses that are creating or safeguarding jobs through that investment. They tend to be granted to businesses more towards the SME end of the spectrum, but there are some schemes which will allow larger enterprises to apply, but at lower intervention rates. They are often regionalised within England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales in terms of the application criteria. So the location of your business can be very important to the access to those regimes. And they would typically fund up to about £1 million of non-repayable funding, with a grant of anything in the region of 100,000 to 300,000 being typical, but they will typically only fund about 10 to 30% of your funding requirements. So you'll need to find the remaining balance of 70 to 90% elsewhere. Innovation grants, on the other hand, are there to support companies' highly innovative R&D projects that are looking to create new products or processes for a market sector. And as I mentioned, you'll typically see partnerships with research organisations happening for businesses that are seeking these sorts of grants. In terms of where they apply, they're UK-wide under the Innovate UK scheme and the European-wide under the Horizon 2020 and Eurostar scheme. The impact of Brexit on access to European grant funding is, of course, something to bear in mind for businesses that are solely established in the UK. In terms of the size of the funding available, it's typically in the region of 25,000 to 10 million of non-repayable funding on the innovation grant side, with anything from 100,000 to 2 million typical. But they'll tend to be slightly higher funding, so they'll fund more like 25% up to about 70% of the project cost. So that can make a fairly significant difference. One or 2 points to note in relation to the current crisis. So we're generally seeing deadlines being pushed back by about 1 to 2 months on average for application to the funding programs. But we are, on the positive side, seeing funds being made available. So there's about a £1.25 billion package being made available in the UK, with about 500 million of that represented by the Future Fund, which effectively provides matched funding for external investment coming into a business. And the remaining 750 million is split roughly 50-50 between providing businesses that have already got a grant with top-up opportunities, subject to the business applying for that, and also a significant sum of money in the region of 200 million or so being made available to businesses that are looking to innovate in ways related to the current global pandemic. One of the other things that we're seeing is that whereas usually you'd have to apply for your funding quarterly in arrears where you've been granted some funding, we're seeing that now that's being unlocked on a monthly basis instead to support cash flow. So that's what that landscape looks like. Before I move on to talk about R&D and Patent Box, if you could just complete all four for me. to give me a sense of your level of knowledge and experience in relation to the R&D and patent box regimes. So have you accessed the R&D and patent box regimes in the UK? A, R&D only, B, patent box only, C, both R&D and patent box regimes, or D, neither. Okay, looks like the poll has closed. Just waiting for the results to come up. Okay, so very little experience of patent box, in fact, no experience of patent box. Some, about 38% of respondents have experience of R&D. Actually, I guess some people must have experience of patent box, given there's 19% in C, but a significant proportion with experience of neither. So I'll step through what the regimes provide at a high level and then seek to draw out some of the important points. So from an R&D perspective, what's important to note is there's two schemes in the UK. So one, which is the SME scheme, will apply where you've got less than 500 employees in your group and either turnover less than 100 million or balance sheet less than 86 million. So some pretty large groups can still qualify for this scheme. The relief under this scheme is provided by way of a 230% super deduction, and where you are a loss-making business, you can surrender that loss at a rate of 14.5%, which equates to an effective relief of 33.35% of qualifying expenditure. So a very valuable relief for a number of businesses. The large company scheme is slightly different in the way it's structured. So a large company is anyone who does not qualify for the SME scheme by virtue of either having too many employees or too high turnover or balance sheet in combination with employees. And it will also be applicable to SMEs where the SMEs have subcontracted out R&D, or in certain instances where the SME's expenditure is subsidized, which means where the project has been grant funded, for example. So it is possible to claim R&D in relation to projects for which you have received grant funding, but you may be kicked into the large company scheme for R&D purposes, depending on exactly how those sources are applied across the projects that you are undertaking. Now, the large company scheme provides for a credit of 13% on your qualifying R&D expenditure. That is an above-the-line taxable credit. So you receive the money, but you have to pay tax on it, which equates to a rate of about 10.53% of effective relief today. In prior periods, it was a credit of only 12%, so the effective relief was lower. But in either case, you can see that the SME scheme is roughly 3 times as valuable as the large company scheme. The key point to note when you're looking at this is that when you're assessing whether you are a large company or a small company, you need to have awareness of any linked enterprises. So if you are private equity backed, then you also would need to take into account the metrics of other entities which are controlled by the private equity house. It's a really important point and it can catch some people out. The other key point to note is that while subcontracted R&D can qualify under the SME scheme, albeit at a rate of 65% of the spend rather than the 400%, subcontracted costs do not qualify under the large company scheme. So the impact of flipping from the small company scheme to the large company scheme can be particularly acute for businesses which subcontract out their R&D either to connected or unconnected parties. So something to be aware of. A few points to really draw out in the current environment. So the way the UK R&D regime is constructed, it's not necessarily restricted to R&D that is geographically undertaken in the UK. So if you have a US R&D branch of a UK company, then subject to working through the rules, the expenditure on the US R&D branch for developers that are physically situated in the US can be included within UK R&D claim. And there's a few different variants of that as well. So thinking through how you manage your R&D globally and manage the relationship between the different enterprises that are undertaking the R&D globally can be hugely important in terms of the influence on your resultant claim. The other point to note is that where you seek to optimize your approach from an R&D perspective in terms of managing the impact of R&D that's undertaken physically outside of the UK in an effective way, that will also give you a better patent box outcome because there's an intrinsic link between the two. So patent box and the R&D model should be viewed together. Another point from a global perspective is that we increasingly see global projects where different parts of an organization are contributing to one overall global project. There can often be huge efficiencies to be gained in the claim process where the technical analysis of what the project involves and whether that qualifies as R&D is undertaken on a centralized basis, because the same guidelines for what represent qualifying R&D are replicated across a large number of the different R&D schemes around the world. So you can find a way to achieve some nice efficiencies in your approach to that. It's also worth noting that different R&D regimes apply in different ways, and it is entirely possible that a single project may qualify for R&D relief in more than one country because of the way that the different regimes interact and overlap. And again, this goes back to planning the way you manage your R&D and set up your model from the start to think about some of these global opportunities. Then looking more specifically at the current crisis, it's worth noting that where a business has received a grant under current government schemes, that will represent EU state aid, and an impact of that is that you would typically not be able to claim under the SME scheme in relation to that if you have expended that money on the relevant development activity that you're trying to claim. So thinking about how you map from grant through to what that grant is expended on can be quite important. Also, there's a lot of people that have sought time to pay arrangements in relation to deferral of tax payments in relation to VAT and employment taxes and other things. Depending on exactly what you sought to defer, HMRC may seek to offset any R&D refund against the tax that you've deferred before you get the balance. So something to be aware of from a cash flow perspective. Not the case in all circumstances, but something that definitely warrants some investigation. Also worth thinking about your resourcing model. If you've got some staff that are no longer engaged full-time, or the nature of their role has changed, think about how you can best utilize their resource and maybe divert them towards R&D projects if they have got technical capabilities. It's also worth noting that supporting staff that contribute to an R&D effort can be included to a degree within an R&D claim. So thinking about how your supporting staff supports your R&D is important as well. It's an opportunity to undertake some R&D benchmarking and assess how you pan out against the global landscape of businesses. And that's we've got various tools that we've built over time that enable us to benchmark typical R&D outcomes across different industry sectors. And also thinking about capturing the R&D spend as it arises. So if you're one of those 24% of businesses that has pivoted your offering, is now the right time to think about maybe capturing how you pivoted your offering and whether some of that could be qualifying for R&D purposes while it's fresh in people's minds. Our experience is generally the closer you do it to when it actually happens, the more qualifying activity you will typically uncover. Moving on to patent box. So in a nutshell, the patent box provides for a 10% tax rate on income related to qualifying rights. And a qualifying right is broadly a patent that's granted in the UK, the EU, or certain EEA countries. Most notably, it doesn't currently apply to the US. We'll have to wait and see what any future trade agreement and Brexit may mean for that. But at the moment, the US is not in scope. The business that is applying for the patent box needs to either own the patent or have an exclusive license in respect to the relevant right. And the patent box covers a wide range of different income, with sales income from products incorporating qualifying IP rights, or license fees from the license of qualifying rights being the two most common that we see. I just want to draw out a few important points. So the really critical point to note is that the patent is the gateway to the regime. You don't actually have to track through to what profits the patent is driving. If the patent is incorporated into a product, then the full product sale proceeds can qualify for the patent box. And likewise, if you've got a technology platform where you have a patented right within a bundle of rights that you're licensing, then where all of those rights are licensed for the same purpose, then the full royalty stream qualifies for patent boxes. So the physical world example of this is if you've got a Boeing 747 aircraft with a patented component within the sat-nav device, then the incorporation of that sat-nav device within the plane is sufficient to qualify the sale of the full plane for the patent box. And the same is true for platform rights, where you have got a patented line of code within a platform that you are licensing. So thinking about how you construct your business model to optimize those outcomes, and also how you can undertake a strategic patenting exercise to obtain the appropriate level of monopoly to balance your commercial and other fiscal desires is particularly important. The other thing to note is, as I said before, there's an intrinsic link between R&D and patent box, and very broadly speaking, you won't get any patent box benefit if your R&D is undertaken in a company other than, or is regarded as being undertaken in a company other than the company which is making the patent box claim. So if you had a company making a patent box claim with a US R&D branch, the US R&D would be regarded as undertaken by the UK company. Likewise, if you had a US company which was loaning staff to the UK company for R&D purposes, then that would be treated as R&D of the UK company. However, if you were in a situation where the UK company was subcontracting R&D to the US company, then that would effectively disqualify you from the benefit of patent box in relation to the other. And the other thing to note is that there's tracking and tracing rules, which very broadly speaking require you to look back 20 years over how the IP in question has been developed. And so if you have developed with a suboptimal R&D model, and then you look to apply patent box in the future, you will have a suboptimal patent box outcome. So this is why I said earlier that it's really important to consider R&D and patent box together if there's any likelihood that you may seek to apply in the future. So just before we turn to a final Q&A, very briefly on what the future might hold. I think many of us are realizing as this crisis goes on that this is more than just a flash in the pan, and it's likely to result in a fundamental change in certain aspects of commercial organizations. So this is just a bit of sort of crystal ball gazing on my part as to what I think it may mean. And when I look at that, I think that I see potential impact on value chains as follows. I think that the current global crisis has exposed some weaknesses in global value chains where there are single sourcing and single manufacturing models. And I expect to see an increase of regional localization. I don't think we'll see a full onshoring of supply chains back into country of destination, because they have been offshored for reasons related to costs, cost efficiencies and skill sets. But I do think that we will see a relative rebalancing of that towards more sourcing and manufacturing closer to customer than we've seen in the past. And I think that links over then to inventory management as well, where we'll see a shift away from this just-in-time model of you manufacture to order to actually holding some stock a bit closer to your customers so that you can weather a storm if needs be. And I think we'll also start to see increasing focus on digital. So businesses looking to pivot so that they can work out how to deliver their products and services to businesses and customers in a more remote fashion than they might have done historically. And really the overlap there from an IP perspective is in terms of what intangibles are you developing to support in that transition, how do you protect them, how do you fund them, and then when they become valuable, how do you ensure that you're accessing incentives where you can. The other thing that I think we're going to see is increased focus on taxation of digital activities. I think that there's been huge government stimulus, as we're all aware. There needs to be a way to fund that government stimulus. There's a lot of speculation as to where that may come from, but tax is going to be one part of the solution. But I think when faced with the decision as to whether a government taxes its own citizens and risks the potential impact on growth that may drive, versus it taxes those foreign businesses which are selling remotely to its citizens, I think most governments will think that it's sensible to try and tax those foreign governments. It is something that we have seen already before the pandemic, but I think is likely to accelerate as a result of the pandemic. The flip side is that the OECD may step in, as it already is trying to do, and say, well, that's not in the interest of anyone in terms of global trade. So let's try and find a multilateral solution to the current challenge, which results in a reallocation of rights for the most highly digitized businesses. The balance of which of those wins will be a function of how quickly the OECD can drive towards multilateral action. The moment they continue to say that they can drive quickly, but I think some major players like the US and Germany could put a spanner in that work if they don't sign up to the concept of the multilateral approach the OECD is suggesting, where the US and Germany would likely be overall losers. So I'll maybe leave it there in the interest of time. I appreciate I've run a bit longer than that. And I'll hand over to Harry to open for Q&A.
Yes, thanks, Ross. Right, let's do quickly. We've only got a few more minutes left, so let's try and get some of these questions done. So the question is, how do we identify what component of our current tech can be patented?
So without the obvious answer, which would be, let me take a look and I'll tell you, we're always looking for some sort of technical advance, technical effect, some sort of advantage. And the first place to look is where the most innovative input went in. And by that, it usually means where the greatest amount of head scratching happened and where there was some form of eureka moment. We've solved the problem. And that's particularly true in computer implemented inventions. With mechanical inventions, it tends to be more straightforward. What feature of your invention is actually new, and does it provide some sort of inventive advance over what's been done before? And that inventive step, which is the inventive step, which is the legal term, doesn't have to be huge, but for mechanical inventions, it's some sort of one novel technical feature that provides some form of advance or advantage over what's been done before. But without actually knowing even what type of invention I'm talking about, it's a bit difficult to answer that any further.
Absolutely, yeah. And just to follow up on some of these related questions here, Vicki and I are part of a patent firm which specializes in identifying these technologies which are suitable for patent protection, and related to the questions of typical costs and fees and timeframes. Emailing it, Vicki, would be probably worthwhile there. But we're out of time anyway, so I think probably these questions should be sent via email afterwards. But for now, thank you both, Vicki and Ross, for giving the talk today. And if you'd like to arrange a follow-up meeting, anyone who's been listening, please email them directly. And also, before everyone goes, we'd like to hear your thoughts. So there'll be a link in the chat box. If you could just take a few moments to give us some feedback, that'd be lovely. But aside from that, thank you all. Thank you for coming if you have been listening. And that's it, I think.